In the House of Commons at Westminster in 1875 sat a small group of Irish members who argued regularly but in vain for Home Rule for Ireland. One day in the chamber, an almost unknown Irish member, Charles Stuart Parnell, ended his maiden speech.
Why should Ireland be treated as a geographical fragment of England, as I heard an ex-Chancellor of the Exchequer call it some time ago? Ireland is not a geographical fragment, but a nation.
The Irish nation in the 1870s was not particularly recognizable as a nation. The Irishman, citizen of the United Kingdom, with no Irish parliament for 70 years, had as his chief concern his well-being on the land, by which he and most of the Irish people lived. Pressure on the land had at least been eased by the Great Famine of the 1840s, and the larger farmer had become more prosperous. The smaller tenant farmers, though there were fewer of them, still harvested their crops to pay the rent, and survived largely on their potato plots. Good times in the mid-70s for small farmers meant times when they could survive without difficulty. But with the end of the 1870s, agricultural prices fell owing to foreign competition, and the small farmer couldn't pay his rent. There were 2 wet seasons with disastrous failures of the potato crop. Without enough to eat and unable to pay his rent, the small farmer began to be evicted. Evictions doubled in 1878 to the highest for over a decade. By 1880, they doubled again. Scenes reminiscent of the Great Famine of the 1840s were reappearing. As in the 1840s, mass starvation loomed. Only 2 things prevented a second famine. One was a charity operation, mounted to a great extent from England, and mounted this time on a massive scale through 2 principal relief committees: a Dublin Mansion House Committee and a committee run by the Duchess of Marlborough. Thus, charity saved the Irish people. But the Irish people bitterly resented that they should need charity. And another saving factor was also at work. A former Fenian, Michael Davitt, was helping tenants organize to resist eviction and to demand lower rents. And he'd persuaded the young Member of Parliament for County Meath, Charles Stuart Parnell, who'd been increasingly making a name for himself on the Irish political scene, to take part in this land agitation.
In bad times, a tenant cannot be expected to pay as much as he did in good times. Now, what must we do in order to induce the landlords to see the position? You must show them that you intend to hold a firm grip of your homestead and lands. You must not allow yourselves to be dispossessed as your fathers were dispossessed in 1847.
So who exactly was this young politician Davitt had got hold of to help him run his land campaign on behalf of the tenants? Well, the first strange thing about him is that he was a landlord, and a Protestant landlord too, owning some 5,000 acres or so up here in County Wicklow, some of the most beautiful country in all Ireland. This is the solid 18th century country house, Avondale, where Parnell was born and spent his early childhood, and which he later owned and rather intermittently lived in for the rest of his life. Here, his father and mother had entertained in style the grand Protestant gentry of the neighborhood. But how, in spite of this family background, had Parnell now become a champion of the Irish people? Well, it wasn't really in spite of it at all. In a way, it was because of it. For Parnell traced his descent back on his father's side to that Protestant Irish tradition of independence from England of the 18th century, which had preceded the Union. His great-grandfather, Sir John Parnell, had been one of the Protestant patriots of that day and had strongly opposed the Union. Then again, his mother was American, and what's more, daughter of a famous American admiral, Charles Stuart, who'd whipped the British in the War of 1812. Parnell was named after him. A certain emotional detachment, then, from loyalty to British government was, you could say, in Parnell's bloodstream. And in this beautiful setting of his home at Avondale in County Wicklow, it was bound to be a consciously Irish detachment, for all his difference in class, from those for whom he was fighting. Fighting, yes, well, that was something else about Parnell's personality that fitted him very well for the political role on which he was embarked. He had a very aggressive side to his nature, as well as a tender one. This may have had something to do with an early childhood experience, because when he was only 6, he was sent away to boarding school in England and to a girls' school, too, at which he was the only boy. Resentment at this cruel rejection must have bitten deep into his character. Cambridge, to which Parnell went in 1865 to read mathematics at Magdalen College. He had rooms on the ground floor overlooking this quad because he was known to be highly strung and given to sleepwalking. Highly strung, perhaps, aggressive, certainly, thinking of himself as an Irishman among Englishmen, and his days at Cambridge ended in an incident in a public street, after which, rusticated by his college, he never came back. One evening, he spent half an hour with companions in Cambridge Station refreshment rooms, drinking champagne and sherry and eating biscuits. Emerging, he knocked down a local manure merchant who he thought had offended him, and was later in court, finally made to pay £20 damages. Back in Wicklow the same summer, he got involved in another fight in a local hotel. Although this time, perhaps because Parnell knew the local magistrates, it was the other man who was fined. When Parnell first entered the House of Commons in 1875, mainly because he was at a bit of a loss what else to do, he very soon made a name for himself by his aggressiveness at question time, and became one of a small group of extremists among the otherwise rather sedate and gentlemanly Irish members who routinely pleaded for an Irish Parliament or Home Rule. One parliamentary correspondent in 1876 wrote this of Parnell.
Something really must be done about Mr. Parnell. Whether heaven has blessed Mr. Parnell with full measure of intelligence, or whether in the composition of his mind something material was omitted, are speculations interesting in themselves, but out of place in this journal. But I repeat, something really must be done about Mr. Parnell.
Michael Davitt summed him up more meaningfully when he described Parnell, with his English education and his English accent, as an Englishman of the strongest sort, moulded for an Irish purpose. Before long, Parnell was deeply involved in Davitt's land agitation and in the House of Commons. As the new leader of an increasingly vigorous Irish party, he was soon pursuing an Irish purpose there.